Good morning, fifth grade. We are back for week 2 of Jim Ugly. Today we are going to read chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8 is titled Fearless and Defiant. I had no intention of returning to put on a wig and have an apple shot off of my head. I looked around for Jim Ugly. There were wagons going by and the baggage master came sauntering up the street, but Jim Ugly was nowhere in sight. I wasn't anxious to meet the yellow leg face to face again, but I felt obliged to deliver Wilhelmina's message. I didn't want to like her, but it was getting kind of hard not to like her. I knocked on the door of the yellow leg's cabin. He didn't answer, and that suited me fine. I hoped to be far away before he recollected where he had seen Jim Ugly. Once he realized it had been Dad's dog scratching at his door and me trailing along behind, he'd have had sense enough to know that there was something peculiar in the wind. I slipped the message under the door and took off down the hill. There was nothing left to keep me in Truckee, except that I didn't have a notion where to go or how to get there. I began meandering along the boardwalk, my hands jammed in my pockets, when a thought went through me like a flash of sunlight. Wilhelmina had received a letter from Dad's own hand. Maybe she had it with her. If Jim Ugly could pick up Dad's scent again, he might be able to point me in the right direction. The smell of fresh bread stopped me in my tracks, and I gazed through the bakery window. I'd forgotten how hungry I was getting. I went inside and counted out some pennies for a nickel's worth of ginger snaps. It was then, through the window, that I saw Jim Ugly across the railroad tracks. He was striding along the riverbank as if being chased by hornets, only it was the yellow leg chasing him. He was riding a burro, whipping it to a trot, with his long legs all but scraping the ground. My mouth full of ginger snaps, I let out as if I'd been shot from a cannon. I knew that Jim Ugly must have stirred the yellow leg's memory. The bounty hunter had pulled a boot over his sore foot, picked up a rope, mounted a burro, and gone out searching for a closer look. I was out in the middle of the street when I put on the brakes. What was I going to do, flag my arms and try to whistle Jim Ugly to me? I didn't have good sense. Why make it easier for the yellow leg to put me and Jim Ugly together? No one was going to catch that dog. I'd keep myself scarce. I watched Jim Ugly racing off. You'd think he was running for the life joy of it. After a moment, the yellow leg gave up the chase and sat for a moment thinking. Then he swung the reins around the burro's neck, and they began crossing the railroad tracks. I ducked well out of sight around a freight wagon loaded with stovepipes. The yellow leg had hardly crossed at the corner when out of nowhere Jim Ugly came up behind me. I supposed he could follow my scent any time he felt like it. He plopped down on the ground to catch his breath, and I glared at him. Don't look so pleased with yourself, I muttered. That yellow leg must be suspicious. How am I going to hide you from him? Tie you up somewhere? He was still wearing the short loop of rope I'd slipped over his neck, and I took hold of it. Tie him up where? And then what? I could count on the wolf coming out in him the moment he'd found himself at the end of a rope. He'd start a howling rumpus. In hardly any time at all, I found myself heading back to the theater with Jim Ugly in tow. I knew what to do. There were all those jars of stage makeup. I tried turning Jim Ugly into a spotted dog or something. I'd stopped on the way and got some meat scraps at the butcher. Once inside the theater door, I opened the butcher paper and left Jim Ugly there to eat. I'll pay you 75 cents per show, the Arizona girl said, trying the blonde wig on me and hanging on to her dog at the same time. But then she put a green apple on top of the wig. Balance it, young feller. Walk around and get used to the feel of it. 75 cents all at once seemed a huge sum, but I had no intention of showing up for the evening performance. All I wanted to see was what I could do with Jim Ugly. Not much money to risk my neck, I said. She gushed out a laugh and gave me a wink with her left eye. Follow me. She led me behind the front curtain. A forest of painted trees, looking as flimsy as doll papers, filled the stage. It wouldn't have surprised me to see my dad step out of the woods, fix me with one eye, and take a bow. The apple dropped off my head a couple of times, but she seemed to expect it. Then she showed me the place where I was to stand against a tree. And if she hadn't stopped me, I'd have walked into a plate glass right in front of it. The audience never sees it. I've never missed the apple yet, child, but only a scrambly-witted fool would take a chance like that. You mustn't tell a soul about the glass. Not anybody, I swore, with considerable relief. The 75-cent salary began to tempt me. I'd need every cent if I was going to keep me and Jim Ugly fed and on our own. What about your mother? All I've got left is a picture, I answered. I came close to hauling it out to show her, but I didn't. An orphan? I hesitated. I didn't know what the right answer was. I'd never before thought of myself as an orphan, and I might not be, but it seemed simpler to nod, so I nodded. She told me that this version of the play had been written especially for her. William Tell is so worried he takes to drink, and his hand shakes. Mrs. William Tell, played by the Arizona girl, the famous markswoman, puts on a red beard and pretends to be her husband when he's forced to shoot an apple off of his own son's head. My part was easy. I was only on stage a few minutes, but I was supposed to hold a fearless and defiant look in my face. The curtain rises at 8 tonight, she said, but I was to be there by 7:30 to get into my costume. She surprised me by paying me the 75 cents in advance, and I looked up into her smile. She was counting on me. I looked at the coins and then I closed my hand on them. I felt a part of her theater company, so I smiled back. She had to leave, and I said I wanted to stay behind to practice looking fearless and defiant. I also told her I had a dog out front. I hope he won't bark during the performance. Not a chance of it, I assured her, and she left. I got a hand on the short rope around Jim Ugly's neck and led him down the theater aisle. He resisted some, but just out of habit, I think, for he came along and I got him to the dressing room. Now stand still, I commanded. I unknotted the rope and meant to keep it off, for the yellow leg was bound to have noticed it. I studied Jim Ugly's fur, and for the first time I saw how many colors he had. His muzzle was honey-colored with flecks of gray, and there was hairs along his back as orange as marmalade. I picked up a fancy tin box of rice powder and used the puff to plot out the orange. I don't know what Jim Ugly was thinking, but it surprised me that he was so patient about it. He hardly flinched when I got a burnt cork out of the glass jar and darkened his ears and the end of his tail. And then I recalled that Dad had often kept him in his dressing room and that these smells would be nothing new. I studied him, and then I went back to the rice powder. He ended up mostly a dirty white, but he looked different enough to suit me. And then I practiced making faces in the mirror. Finally, I turned to Jim Ugly and lifted one eyebrow. Do I look fearless and defiant? Chapter 9, The Letter. I had a picture in my mind of Dad's letter to Wilhelmina folded inside the sparkly bead-covered purse she carried. Or did she have it laid away in one of her suitcases? I shrugged off the notion that she might have thrown it away. Jim Ugly would need a sniff or two of that letter to track Dad's scent, but how was I to get hold of it? Wilhelmina wasn't apt to hand it over to a stranger. Of course, child, of course you can read my personal mail, whatever your name is. Not in 1,000 years. Suddenly, Dad's voice came to me as if he stepped to the footlights. Be bold, Jake. Boldness, again, boldness, and ever boldness. Danton at the Bastille, Act 2, Scene 3. I'd try. Jim Ugly shook himself and raised a cloud of rice powder. Once outside, he went bouncing around in the brisk air, and I hardly recognized him myself. Heel, I commanded. He knew what it meant, but it didn't interest him to heel for me. He flashed me a short glance as if to say I couldn't possibly be going anywhere that interested him. I set out for the hotel alone. In the lobby, I saw a couple of men in capes and cravats and stick pins with stones the size of glass paper weights. I had a notion they were actors. William Tell himself sat in a leather chair reading a newspaper. I recognized him from the theater posters. I guess the whole company of players must be putting up at the Weber house. I'd already devised my speech by the time I knocked on Wilhelmina's door and rehearsed it while I waited for her to open it. When she appeared, all copper hair in her surprised smile, I forged ahead boldly. Miss Wilhelmina Marleybone Jenkins, I said. I know the yellow-legged gent to be a desperate character. He put a bullet in Sam Bannock's shoulder. If there's a letter from Sam Bannock, it's bound to say it was D.D. Skeets who tried to murder him in cold blood. That yellow leg would soon shoot for you as not. Her eyes opened like the petals of a 4 o'clock. I seemed to be taking her breath away. He's that mean, I rushed on. His hide's full to the top with meanness. I could slip that letter in my back pocket for you. It'd be safe there if he was to rip open your purse. I wouldn't want to trouble you, she said at last. No trouble at all, miss. But the letter didn't say anything about Dee Dee Skeet shooting at him. He'd think it, bound to. Let's not worry about the yellow leg, she said, and it was clear she wasn't taking me very seriously. As for the letter, it's not in my purse. I guess it wouldn't be, I said, thinking as fast as I could. Well, of course not. A thing like that belongs in a suitcase. No, young man, she answered. I left it in San Francisco with my other love letters. I felt the air go out of my boldness. Love letters? Is that what Dad had written her? A tenacious love letter? I tried not to let confusion show on my face, but I suppose it did. I don't suppose you've got anything else of his hanging about? I muttered softly. Nothing, she answered, the way her eyes fixed themselves on me. I knew she was trying to read my mind. Why are you so interested in Sam Bannock? I heard you talking about him. I didn't say anything about a bullet in his shoulder. Who are you? Me, miss? What's your name? My stage name, you mean? She didn't give me time to think of one. She didn't need to. She had already added up a sum of numbers. You're that boy of Sam Bannock's, aren't you? John? No, I answered after a moment. Jake. She took a small breath and began to smile. I'm glad to know you at last, Jake. Call me Wilhelmina. Come in. She motioned me to a rocking chair at one window and then stood as straight as a parasol at the other. Sam didn't tell me about you, she said, as if it were my fault. Well, he didn't tell me about you either, I said. A gentleman doesn't bandy about a lady's name, she answered, snapping to his defense. Her chin was tilted and her eyes were fearless and defiant. She has it down exactly right, I thought. I tried to do it that way myself tonight. There was a dead silence, and through the window I watched heavy clouds breaking like ocean waves over the hilltop. I hoped it wouldn't rain. That would wash out Jim Ugly's disguise. My dad didn't steal your diamonds, I said firmly. Of course he didn't. Then why is Mr. Cornelius after him? Because Mr. Cornelius disagrees. Mr. Cornelius is convinced that Sam has 40 pounds of diamonds. 40 pounds! Can you imagine that? No. And I must own a pound or two. Cornelius, who manages my business affairs, has confessed to me that he used my money to help buy the sparkling hoard. I much prefer stage jewelry. The stones are so much bigger. But off he went to Amsterdam to buy diamonds in bargain lots and then went careless enough to allow them to be stolen. Maybe the police will find them or something. He refuses to notify the police. Why? Perhaps there's something fishy about those diamonds. She lowered her voice to a whisper and grinned. Perhaps he smuggled them into the country? Imagine. My dad didn't take them. I promised to help Mr. Cornelius find the diamonds. He promised to help me find your father. Maybe if those two meet, they can settle their misunderstanding, and someone will call off that yellow leg assassin. My spirits lifted, but only for a moment. So, Jake, if you've come to Truckee to meet your father, trust me. Tell me where you are meeting. My guard shot back up. You've got it wrong, I said. My dad is not in Truckee. I got up as I saw it start to rain, and I began to worry about Jim Ugly. I'll be going. She held out her hand, and I shook it quickly. The bones in her fingers seemed hardly bigger than a bird's. Good night, she said. Good luck tonight, she said. I'll be in the audience to applaud your fearless performance. Then she added, let's keep an eye out for Sam Bannock. He can smell grease paint and stage dress miles off, wherever he is.